We will have questions now. I would ask you to limit your point to a question, and I will not allow anybody to speak longer than 3 minutes so we can maximize our time for questions and answers. Over here and then up there.
I'm curious about...
Could you keep it down a little bit, please?
I'm curious about the middle map on the bottom. Where did that come from? It looks like a Jewish homeland extending right through Jordan and into Iraq from that.
Yeah, I apologize. I haven't had the time to go into much detail or to comment on that. The second map of Stand With Us says Jewish homeland 1920. Here's the story. In 1919, the World Zionist Organization submitted a memo to the Paris Peace Conference, which came after the First World War, and asked for the establishment of a Jewish state, which will include all of Mandate Palestine and extend to South Lebanon, parts of the Shuf area of Mount Lebanon, then cuts into all of the southern region of the Bekaa Valley up to the central city of Jenin, and move east into the eastern ranges of the Lebanese mountain, including Mount Hermon, and from there, Jabal Sheikh, and from there go east to cut into what is now East Jordan and the Hijaz Railway that goes all the way to the Aqaba. Now, it is a memo which the World Zionist Organization submitted. The memo was rejected by Britain and France. They had their own schemes. They had reached agreements between themselves during the First World War. Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916, where they subdivided the East. So they refused it, and the French said, Lebanon belongs to us, Syria belongs to us. So the Brits said, limit yourself to Mandate Palestine. So how it became a Jewish homeland, simply a memo submitted to a peace conference, I don't know. But as this colleague of mine said in his memo, and I read it to you, it doesn't matter what the fact is. They rely on the ignorance of the public of the issues and sell them this kind of trash. So I hope this explains to you where this map comes from.
Okay, there's a question up here and then a question down here.
Thank you, sir, for your lecture tonight. My name's Tim. I study political science at UBC, and just turning our focus to current peace negotiations, some concern that some folks have is that there's no a leader, representative of the Palestinian Authority that has a social license or the legitimacy to negotiate on behalf or to sign over certain territories in a two-state solution. It doesn't have a legitimate mandate from the rest of the Arab world. When John Kerry goes to Israel and sits down with Abbas and Bibi, is there someone that can actually say we'll give up 50% of Jerusalem and share the old city? Would this individual be at risk of being shot? Is that a concern to you?
Negotiations have been going on between the Palestinians and Israelis since 1993. That's 21 years. And not 1 inch of Palestinian land in the West Bank has been returned to the Palestinians. The Israeli leadership would probably take it for another 20 years and maybe 200 years and will not bring the negotiations to a conclusion. And how do they explain that? How do they explain the fact that 21 years reached nowhere, although the Oslo Agreement of 1993 gave 5 years only. And then all the agreements for the roadmap agreements pushed by the Americans were never implemented. No, my friend, there is now 550 to 600,000 Jewish colonial settlers in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And I tell you, no Israeli leader, not Netanyahu, not the Knesset, no authority can push them out. A civil war would take place in Israel. My suggestion to you and to the Palestinian leadership is to try another quote. Put your hand in the hands of the Jews of Palestine and Israel and work for a one state, binational one state. And there's no other solution.
It's Dr. Hani. I remember we had a discussion a few years back, and you were saying that it was one-on-one discussion, and you were saying that the ultimate goal of the Israeli state is to push as many Palestinians and Arab outside of Palestine. I mean, ethnic cleansing on a daily basis. We know that they cannot displace tens of thousands at once, so they create all kinds of laws to achieve that. Now, and we're seeing this in practice, but I'd like to hear your opinion about the Israeli policies within the state of Israel, within for the Palestinian population that remain, and also how does that differ from the West Bank and Gaza?
You're absolutely right, Khalid. Jerusalem is the most stark example of ethnic cleansing. Do you know that if you are a Palestinian from Jerusalem and you go out of the city, come to Canada, become a Canadian citizen, try and go back to Jerusalem, your residency will be pulled away from you. You're not allowed. If you send your son to go to get his education outside for 3 or 4 years, by the time he comes, he's no longer fit to reside in Jerusalem. And if your family owns a house and you leave that house and you live in Amman, say, and come back to get your house, that house will be confiscated. So it's a daily hurtful process that Palestinians, especially in Jerusalem, have to experience and suffer. You tell me about the Palestinians of Israel pre-67. Well, there's approximately 1.3 million Arabs, Palestinians, who have the Israeli citizenship. Add to that about 250,000 in East Jerusalem. So you're talking about 1.55 million who are classified as Israeli citizens. It depends who among the Israeli leadership you talk to. Have you heard what Avigdor Lieberman wants to do with them? He wants them out. We will give you lands in the West Bank, but you must leave Israel and leave your citizenship behind. So they want a pure Jewish state. The unfortunate thing is that this continuous Israeli demand for recognition by the Palestinians of the Jewishness of the state has many designs behind the slogans, one of which is to take away the rights of immigrant Palestinians in the Exodus. Remember, there are 11 million Palestinians now. About 5.5 live in historic Palestine, but more than 6 million outside as immigrants. And of course, Israel would not allow a single one to return to his home or to his lands, and has made it clear. But for those who remain within Israel, their status is sealed as second-grade citizens, discriminated against in government services, in recruitment to civil service, and in government development funds, educational and social, to all their towns. You will notice that Palestinian towns are the least developed in Israel. And the reason is they're not given much aid by the government. Take a Jewish community, take its neighbors, a Palestinian community, and compare between the two. And you will see the stark difference. Now, the amazing thing, you're talking about the Jews of Palestine. Jews internationally, historically, have always been known to be protectors of human rights, promoters of human rights, people who have been involved in human rights movements throughout the globe. And look what their political entity is now doing. So I'm not very optimistic about the fate of Palestinian Arabs inside Israel, and neither the fate of Palestinian Arabs in the West Bank. As for Gaza, as you know, when Sharon decided to move out in 2005, his aides made some stark revelations. Weisglass, his right-hand man, said, "We have now placed the Palestinian issue in formaldehyde." What did he mean by that? That from now on, no more Palestinian issue. Don't talk to us about Palestinian issue. We just gave you Gaza, and that's enough. And he didn't give it because of the goodness of his heart. As you well know, there were only about 5,000 colonial settlers, and they needed 20,000 soldiers to protect them in one of the most deprived and poor regions in the world. It has now more than 1.7 million individuals. And guess what? Hardly has drinking water now, because its subterranean water has intermixed with seawater. And it is at a level where, if our environmental predictions happen, most of Gaza will be underwater. So when they left Gaza, not of the goodness of their heart, but because they know, given also the Gazans' determination to resist and making the Israelis pay continuously day after day, then they decided to move out. Just like what happened in southern Lebanon when they removed their forces from Lebanon in 1990 and decided to leave South Lebanon. Why did they do it? Because they were reached a point where there was a one-to-one casualty. The Israelis were paying one casualty to one casualty from the Shiite groups. And that's a ratio that they cannot afford. So they decided to move out. Again, not of the goodness of their heart. So unless there's an international community and a movement that takes these issues and public clamors to protect the freedoms and human rights of the Palestinian population, there will come a time in the coming few decades where the Palestinians would truly experience a major tragedy. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a few hands up here. I just wanted to ask before we went on to the question, how many people are here tonight because they saw the ad and invitation in the Georgia Strait today? Okay. The fellow in the reddish jacket, orange.
Thank you. I'm a retired history teacher with a specialty in this area. I have 2 comments and 1 question. I don't know whether I should make a comment first or the question or the other way around. Perhaps the question first. Do you know who produced these maps, when they were produced, and when they were brought here by the Palestinian Coalition? Were they vetted for historical accuracy? I'm told by the group that you gave them the imprimatur that these maps were halal. Now, 2 things. Look at map number 2. It says UN plan. It doesn't have the word partition. It says Israel. There was no Israel. And Jerusalem and Bethlehem, and according to the sea, a corpus separatum, do not show on that map. That's a bad map. The next one, the two areas in green. Egyptian occupied Gaza. The large area, Jordanian annexed West Bank. You wouldn't know it from that map. And that, as a history teacher, disturbs me greatly. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I put a question to you. It says UN Plan 1947. What was the UN Plan of 1947? Is there anything other than the partition plan? My friend,
Where's the word?
don't be, you're trying to be technically pushing point. But it 47 UN plan is the partition plan. It is the November 1947 plan. There is no other plan in 1947. You tell me they should have said UN partition plan? Fine, they should have done that. I agree with you.
Okay.
But does it change the facts of the map? One. Two, as I told you, the maps refer to three items. One, the population, the people of the land. Two, the ownership of the land. And three, the culture, the dominant culture of the land. And what it tells you, that according to the UN Plan of 47, and later from 1949, the establishment of Israel, and after the 48-49 war, up till 1967, this was the case. Israel, prior to 67, had control of all that area. Now, UN Plan of 47, I agree with you. It said an Arab plan, and an Arab state and a Jewish state. So again, but is there, I see the point, but it's a technicality. It does not change anything about the reality of the maps. As for Jerusalem, Jerusalem, according to the partition plan, was to be a corpus separatum, and it was to be administered by the United Nations. We know that. But what these gentlemen did was to include Jerusalem as a black spot there, as a black spot, to indicate also its Arab population. And as you know, in 1967, in 1948, the Israelis, or the Zionists, before the Israel was established, went into West Jerusalem and totally and absolutely cleansed the city of its Arab population, and then moved to take over all of their properties without allowing them to resort to law courts or to get compensation. And only Arab East Jerusalem remained within Arab hands. Now, of course, West Bank came under the dominion of the Hashemite Republic of Jordan. And it was by a pre-arranged plan between the Hashemite king, Abdullah, and the Zionist movement. We know about the details of that. Yes, but that doesn't mean that the West Bank was no longer Palestinian. And that's what the story of these maps is. Again, when you tell me there was no, like the StandWithUs says, there was no Palestinian government. I didn't say there was a Palestinian government. But why was there no Palestinian government? Have you asked yourself? Here's the story. All the lands of the Arab East, Fertile Crescent regions, were part of an Ottoman Empire, an Islamic state that included other dominations. And they were considered as citizens of that state. And the Ottoman Empire established in the mid-16th century and stayed till the early 20th century. So they were members of that state. And prior to that, There were members of the empires that grew up since the rise of the Umayyads, followed by the Abbasids, followed by the Mamluks, by the Ayyubids, and by others. They were parts of large empires. The nation state began to take shape in the Middle East after the First World War. Lebanon was placed under the trusteeship of France. Syria was placed under the trusteeship of France. Iraq was placed under the trusteeship of England. And Palestine was placed as an international trusteeship. But what are we talking about? Again, we're saying the Palestinians are there. Palestine, mandatory Palestine. It was called the government of Palestine under the British. And the Palestinians formed the majority of the population. Why suddenly they don't hardly exist in 49? Why suddenly have they lost all their rights and properties? Why have they been moved out? That's the question you should ask yourself. So when the plan tells you this was the partition plan, this were its parameters, and this is what happened post-19, from 48 up till 67, and this is what's happening today, it is accurate. You may come and argue with me about small items, but you cannot argue with me about the general themes: Palestinian population, Palestinian land ownership, and Palestinian culture. Where did these maps come from? They appear in Wikipedia, and they were used by many pro-Palestinian organizations throughout the United States.
Do you know who created these maps?
Who?
And when?
Go ahead.
2010, June. A Quaker group and a group with the blog If America Only Knew. They are the joint authors
Okay.
of that map series.
That's totally irrelevant. Let's go on to some other. Okay, I've got quite a few people here. So Nathan, Mariana, and the woman there, I'm going to ask you each to make your statement or your question, and then I'll turn it over to Hani. So.
Well, I'm sort of interested in the fact that several governments have adopted legislation which permits their courts, including their criminal courts, to consider cases and petitions from elsewhere. And dear old Mr. Pinochet ran afoul of that when he went to Britain expecting to get medical treatment, which he needed very seriously, and was hit by a petition, if I'm not mistaken, from a Spanish judge who had the guts and the balls, etc., and the knowledge, to submit a petition to a British court, claiming, of course, that Pinochet was guilty of murder in the hundreds and thousands. And that petition ended up in the hands of a British judge who, as many judges often do in a tight spot, sort of fudged a bit, but he was considering it enough to make Pinochet very worried that he was going to end up in a very bad situation. And I'm just wondering, has anyone ever suggested to the Palestinians that several of them, as I know and have seen, have the deeds to their properties in Jerusalem, in Hebron, in Nablus, in wherever, and that they should simply see if they cannot find a judge with the same amount of balls that that guy had, and file petitions for criminal cases to be brought against all the people who, I have a Palestinian friend who's asked me not to mention his name, who went back to Jerusalem.
Could you wrap up, please?
Where his family owned a home, and went to the home, knocked on the door, and an Israeli answered the door and asked him, well, what could he do for him? And he said, well, I used to live here, I grew up. Would you possibly permit me just to go into my childhood bedroom? And the Israeli was gracious enough. I guess, who knows, maybe he thought that they would bring the cops or something, to let him. and that he went to. So,
Nathan, we're running out of time
so
here
of
for
course,
everybody else.
what I'm wondering is why can't we do something more effective than we've done before to bring action on the goddamn Israelis who are criminals in the ordinary sense of the term and in the jurisprudential sense of the term.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me for
Just because there was a lot of gender-specific references to judges, I want to point out that some of the most courageous judges in Colombia don't happen to have any balls. They happen to be women, and they're enormously courageous. Before Hani responds, I want to get in the two other people, Mariana and the woman over here. And if we have time, then there's another
So
3 or 4.
recently I was in Beit Sabur, which I understand is in Area A, and we met a family there who has a decent piece of land, and their hope would be to build houses for other members of the family on that land, and they're not allowed to do that. So I'm kind of wondering how that is, and they also told us they had been offered a check with no limits on it, if they would just go away.
Okay, and the woman, could you stand up so everybody could hear, please?
I just want to comment on so you're a retired history teacher?
Yes.
And I'm a current history teacher.
I can commiserate.
For some of the system, we have some people that are teachers. BC gives us a curriculum that we need to teach. And I've memorized that curriculum because I'm new. And in school, we teach kids in grade 8, they learn about ancient Israel, like the idea of Moses, Jesus, Muhammad. They learn that, and then after grade 8, they learn about revolutions, they learn about Canadian history, and they jump to this map, 1946, when it comes to socialism 11. My problem with this is that the kids learn about this ancient Israel, like the ancient Jewish kingdom, and then boom, we jump to 1946, and we don't teach your kids Jewish history. And I think that's doing a dissatisfaction to our Jewish communities, because they have a rich history, they need to learn that as well. If you know the Jewish history, in line with the Palestinian, you'll learn that Palestinians and whatever Palestinians, Arabs, they're actually one group. Like you said, live side by side underneath the Ottoman Empire. When I saw this banner, I was excited because I saw 2 sets of maps with 2 stories. The top maps, I have no problem with. I'm a critical thinker. I question everything because in history, that's what you have to do. But it tells a story. It tells a story about a population that has been pushed into a corner. They've been there just as long as the ancient Jewish kingdom. These Palestinians have been there alongside our. So there's that story. Underneath it, you have another story. It's going to. I feel like these maps just tell a story. And you were saying the common person on the bus, would they understand the whole history? Who cares? We want to get a message across that these Palestinian people are being marginalized. Those maps tell that story. The bottom map is countering it. So, I don't know. I think the top maps I just wanted to ask you were, is your issue with the statistical facts or is it the story?
No. I'm not reopening that. So thank you for your comments as a history teacher, but we're not reopening that
Also,
question.
you think, give me generalized, that to me is one thesis statement, those 4 maps together. Is that fair to the common public? Did you give them a generalized kind of story of what's going on? Or do we need to somehow educate them in more depth?
Of course, we need to do much more than that. This is only one small effort. I want you to be aware that the Palestinian society and the people of Palestine are, to many, the descendants of the old inhabitants of the land. They are the Canaanites, they are the Hebrews, they are the Arabs. So a Palestinian, you're way wrong if you feel somehow you can say over 3,000 years there is distinct racial purity among anyone, Jewish or Palestinian. So respect this Palestinian community which has came over the centuries. It took its Arab identity in the 7th century. But as a population, it existed for all times on the land. And it has Jewish blood, and Arab blood, and Canaanite blood, and any blood of any power that came over the area. This is one. Second, I truly appreciate your comments. Fully agree with much of what you said. But I've been involved in what you are asking for personally in my capacity as president of the Association of Arab University Graduates in North America. In the 1990s, we tried, and early this century, we tried very hard and took court cases to courts in New York and Washington. There's a law in the US which says anyone, even a non-American citizen, can come to an American court and raise a case against a war criminal or a war crime and ask for justice. We did that against Israeli military leaders who went assassinating Palestinians in the Gaza Strip and killing in the process hundreds of innocent civilians. We also did it with a community in South Lebanon, which took refuge in a United Nations camp and then was blown to smithereens by Israeli cannon fire. We took both cases to courts and we documented them. And we worked with a very eminent law firm, a law association, which is in New York, about American lawyers for justice. The unfortunate thing, and we actually handed over the petitions to the Israeli generals when they came to the US. In the deliberations of the court, we suddenly find an emissary from the State Department who told the judge, these are allies of the United States of America and they are protected by a diplomatic immunity. They were issued suddenly passports by the Israeli embassy. And in both cases, the court then dismissed the case. But in about 15 years ago, throughout Europe, especially England, Holland, and some other European countries, several lawyers, Palestinian lawyers, went out and raised cases in the court system incriminating Israeli leaders, and among them Sharon, that they committed war crimes. And Sharon had to be spirited out of Holland, didn't even go down from the aircraft, ran away, because there was an edict to take him to court. And so was it several Israeli officials in the UK. They came to Heathrow and they were advised not to go down and they returned to Israel. So what was happening there? Europeans became very alarmed that Israelis were being taken to courts and using their own laws. So what happened is that many European governments have changed their laws, their legislation, repeat their legislation so as not to allow people from outside the country to raise cases against Israeli war criminals.
There was the one other question up there about somebody who wanted to build on their land.
Oh, yeah. You went to Beit Sahur, you said, yeah. Right? Well, in Oslo, in 1993, the agreement between the PLO and the Israeli delegation was to divide the West Bank into 3 areas, A, B, and C. Beit Sahur, I think, falls in Area A. In Area A, supposedly the PLO has security and administrative authority. In Area B, it has civil authority but no administrative authority. And in Area C, it has no authority whatsoever, which is the largest part of the West Bank. This arrangement was supposed to last for 5 years only. What happened since then is whether it's A, B, or C. The Israelis consistently and year after year go around and demolish any houses that the Palestinians built. And the reason is Palestinians, no matter what they try, and however they try to submit for a license, are never issued a license to construct houses. And what's the reason? Again, Khalid mentioned it, to spirit them out, encourage them to leave. Go to the Gulf, work in the Gulf, go to North America, take a visa to Chile, or move to Canada. Why? So that you forget this place and the land. And unfortunately, there's not much that the Palestinian Authority can do, neither in terms of administration nor in terms of security. They're the weaker party.
Okay, we're really supposed to be out of here now, but I'm going to take 3 quick questions here. The fellow in the back against the wall. Please try and do it within a minute so there's a chance to respond.
I'm wondering what your perspective is on the movements of Jewish people inside Israel.
I tell you, the greatest partners for the Palestinians are Jews of conscience. They are the strongest supporters of the Palestinians.
Norm, and then the fellow up there.
Using your criteria for what was painted green up there, shouldn't there be some dots in the Israel for where the 1.3 million Palestinians live?
The problem is, if you take the 3 elements, yes, in terms of population, there has to be a few dots, especially in the Galilee, where there's still some Palestinian towns. The unfortunate thing is that they have no land ownership. 92% of the land of Palestine was given to the Jewish National Fund. And according to the dictates of the Jewish National Fund, you may not allow any Palestinian to work on the land or to lease the land or to buy the land. This is Jewish people land in perpetuity. So you talk about discrimination, you talk about apartheid, and then they come and contest it. What a joke of whole towns, hundreds of towns, Jewish towns, where you're not allowed as an Arab Palestinian to come and live in it among them.
Okay, up there, this will be the last questions.
Thanks for an excellent presentation. I just wanted to come back to the issue of solutions, the two-state. As we're all sort of aware of, there's been a big shift towards support for a one-state solution in the last several years, and I just wanted to get some comments on that. Specifically, there's good reasons for that. We know there's an apartheid situation within Israel, and Israel and its partner, the U.S., have been blocking the two-state solution for so long. You can understand the frustration with the two-state solution. Nevertheless, it is the international consensus. It's voted at the UN every year, and the leadership of both sides back it. So your comment was that given the situation with the settlers, it would be politically very difficult or impossible to have a two-state solution, which I found a bit surprising, although I think that's true. A one-state solution is, if we're looking at what's politically realistic and feasible, is even more remote. So I can't imagine a way to a one-state solution that doesn't go through the two-state. And I'm just hoping.
Absolutely. The two-state solution is the present international consensus. In our discussions with various delegations of various states at the United Nations, myself and my colleagues, we were always told, don't come to us, go to the Palestinian Authority leadership. Tell them to call for the Palestinian state. And we will follow. But as long as the Palestinian Authority itself is raising the banner of two states, we cannot but follow. 1. 2. When Theodor Herzl wrote his famous book, Judenstaat, the Jewish state, you know what he said? In 50 years, I will have a Jewish state. Okay? And in 50 years, he had a Jewish state. Now, there were no Jews, hardly any Jews. The Jews that were there were Arab Jews, and we're part of the community. There's no Jewish ownership. They hardly knew Palestine. Herzl had not known Palestine. Neither many of his colleagues had ever been to Palestine. And yet he said that. Of course, it's an ideal. But sometimes people need an idea that triggers their and channels their activities. And this is one. And it's worthy not just for the Palestinian, for the Jew himself. Because in the future, no matter how long it is, if the discrimination remains, it cannot stay.
We collected $870 tonight, so thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, great.